In this clip, we're going to be revising the question about how strong the Roman Senate was during the late Republic. Was it strong or was it weak? And we're going to base our revision looking at a typical question on this particular topic. So a typical question would be probably one of those 36-mark essay questions that you'd have 55 minutes to spend writing, and we're going to base it around this particular question. The Senate had very little control over public affairs during this period. To what extent the sources support this view? Now, as always, warning, this is a revision clip, so the way that we're going to do with this is just a suggestion. For the sake of revision, we're going to work through this chronologically, but obviously be aware you could easily adapt this and write in a more thematic way. So, how are we going to deal with this particular question? Well, first of all, we're going to address Sulla's dictatorship using Plutarch as a writer. Obviously, really very important to always tie what we're saying to the ancient sources. Following Sulla's dictatorship, we're going to look at the rise of Pompey in his early career, especially using the historian Sallust. And then we're going to be looking at how Pompey and Crassus's consulship in the 70s BC further undermined the Senate and reversed a lot of Sulla had done during his dictatorship. We'll be looking at Pompey's special commands, particularly the Lex Manilia. Following that, we'll look at one of the highlights for senatorial power, which would be Cicero's consulship during 63 BC. And then following Cicero's consulship, we'll be looking at the First Triumvirate using Plutarch, Suetonius, and of course the views of Cicero, and Caesar's dictatorship, where you again could argue that the Senate is seriously undermined using Plutarch, Suetonius, and Cicero. And finally, we're going to finish off the clip by addressing the issue of the Second Triumvirate using Suetonius, but this time using the historian Appian. So it's really important that you make sure that you've got a structure in your head and that you can easily link to what you're saying to the ancient sources. So let's start off with Sulla and Sulla's dictatorship. And of course, remember that our module really starts with Marius and Sulla's rivalry. And that really does reach a peak with the dispute over the command against Mithridates of Pontus. And if you remember, Mithridates had started a revolt in the east, and there had been a dispute as to which general to send to deal with Mithridates. Obviously, Sulla and Marius had already had a long rivalry. And if you want to do a little bit of further reading, of course, look at Jugurtha, look at their actions during the social wars, and of course, use Sallust for that. Anyway, cut a long story short, Sulla is given command against Mithridates by the Senate, starts to assemble his forces, and then Marius uses a tribune, a guy called Sulpicius, to get the Senate to reverse the decision. That prompts Sulla to march on the capital with his army for the first time a Roman army had done that, and to get the Senate to reverse the decision. Marius and his supporters fled. This then means that Sulla was able to go and prosecute the war against Mithridates. In the meantime, pesky little Marius is back in Rome, again with his supporters, notably Cinna, regaining power and attacking Sulla in his absence. And that means that Sulla has to come all the way back to Rome to deal with the Senate and to deal with Marius and his supporters one more time. Obviously, we're vastly simplifying the story here because, of course, our question isn't really about Sulla versus Marius and Mithridates. It's about the strengths and weaknesses of the Senate. So Sulla's marches on Rome puts him in a position where he is in control of the Republic. And Marius, of course, has died of old age by this point, leaving just his supporters in Rome. Now, what can we use for our material on this? Well, Plutarch gives us some great material in his life of Sulla. If you remember, Plutarch, great biographer, writes his parallel lives. Sulla, interestingly, is paired with Lysander. Lysander, the Spartan general, who you could argue brings about the collapse of the Spartan system by the incorporation of wealth into Sparta and the corruption of what that brings. Equally, maybe Plutarch's making the argument that Sulla corrupts the Republic by his actions. So he actually means well to try and strengthen the Senate, but the actual methods that he uses ultimately lead to its destruction. Speaking of methods, Sulla is of course always associated with the prescriptions, and in verse 31 we can see that Plutarch explains how the prescriptions were initially targeted towards political enemies, but then essentially targeted anyone of wealth. As dictator, Sulla passes a number of reforms, and the whole aim is to strengthen the Senate and to undermine threats to the Senate, such as the populares and such as another figure like a Marius coming back in. There's obviously the noteworthy story of Sulla seeing many Mariuses when he sees Caesar. Anyway, Sulla's reforms. The Senate numbers are increased to further reinforce and reiterate the importance of the Senate. The Lex Villarionalis is reinforced. That's the law that talks about the age of the magistracies that you can hold and how often you can hold those magistracies, such as being consul just once every 10 years. The muzzling of the tribunate is really important because the tribunes had clearly been used by Marius as almost puppets. So Sulla ensures that tribunes can no longer veto, and he also takes away a vast raft of powers away from them, basically making the tribunate a dead-end job. In addition, Sulla also ensures that the Senate controlled the court and the juries of the quaestio system. So essentially, Sulla has, by his reforms, attempted to strengthen the Senate, to tie it back to our question. However, the methods that he used, such as marching on Rome and his prescriptions, are actually going to be realized by people like Caesar and people like Octavian at the end of the module to really destroy the power of the Senate. Let's move on to Pompey. So Pompey is obviously tied to Sulla in regards to his early career, and particularly his rise and Sulla's promotion of Pompey's career. Pompey had raised an illegal army underage for Sulla on his second march on Rome, and certainly Sulla had very much promoted Pompey's career. However, that relationship certainly cools, and if we use Plutarch verse 41, we can see that relationship cools, particularly over Pompey wanting a triumph. That was controversial because it was a triumph over other Romans. There's the sassy little reply, remember, that Pompey gives to Sulla about more people worshipping the rising sun than the setting sun. After Sulla has resigned his dictatorship, there is a rebellion of Lepidus, who attempts to reverse Sulla's laws, and Pompey is sent by the Senate because of a lack of alternatives. Of course, make sure you're aware that Pompey, by this point, isn't even a senator. He's a very powerful individual, but he's not a senator. And then once he's dealt with the rebellion of Lepidus, Plutarch tells us in verse 17 that he intimidates the Senate in order to send him against the rebel Marian governor of Spain, Sertorius. And then whilst in Spain attempting to deal with the rebel governor Sertorius, Pompey writes to the Senate basically demanding money and supplies. Now, this is great because this is firstly showing the weakness of the Senate, that they're being essentially intimidated by someone like Pompey. But obviously, the great thing about what Plutarch's writing is it's corroborated by Sallust. And Sallust tells us about Pompey's letter that he writes to the Senate in a lot more detail than Plutarch, and what he writes to the Senate from Spain. Sallust, of course, is incredibly valuable because he's a near contemporary to these events. So there's a very good chance that Sallust, whilst he wouldn't have been in the Senate at that particular time, he certainly would have known senators that would have been involved in the debates and the discussions. So Sallust is a really good source to back up what Plutarch has mentioned to us here. The letter that Pompey writes to the Senate is particularly menacing. He basically says that the Senate aren't really grateful to him, that they've not really supported him in his war against Spain. But then the crucial thing is when he's asking for supplies and he's asking for money, he actually threatens the Senate directly. And you can see it, you can see it here rather. Our army will pass over into Italy, bringing with it all the war in Spain. It's almost the same as Plutarch's account, but it shows you that perhaps the Senate isn't really as strong as what Sulla had intended with his reforms. There's a second example from Sallust, and it's from the Tribune Macer's speech to the people. And what this is Macer, who's aligned to Pompey, attacking the rule of the Optimates, but urging the people to support Pompey because Pompey was going to bring about the power of the tribunes, which might surprise you because Sulla had obviously got rid of the tribunes. Pompey, one of Sulla's lieutenants, is now seeing that he wants to bring back the tribunes. mainly because of the benefit that he can gain from this really powerful political office. Mesa firstly turns the people against the optimates and the nobles, but then secondly, he again reiterates that Pompey is a champion almost of the poor. He will join you and lead you in the restoring of the power of the tribunes. Now, obviously, the Spartacus revolt is going on at the same time, and Pompey summoned back to Italy to assist Crassus in dealing with the slave revolt. Obviously, that's the start of their rivalry about who would take credit over dealing with Spartacus. And following the destruction of the revolt, Pompey and Crassus, we're told, camped their armies very close to Rome in order to pressurize the Senate to allow them to stand for election for the consulship, which especially in Pompey's case is incredibly controversial because, of course, Pompey hadn't worked his way up the cursus honorum. They are indeed allowed to stand for the consulship, which again shows you that the Senate are particularly weak. And as consuls in 70 BC, they systematically overturn all of Sulla's reforms, or a big majority of Sulla's reforms, including, of course, bringing about the tribune. The obviously cheery scene that you can see here is the mass crucifixion of Spartacus's followers, which of course Crassus did in order to underline that it was he that was responsible for the defeat of the rebellion and not Pompey. So let's fast forward a little bit after 70 BC, and after we've seen the tribunes being reversed, after we've seen Pompey essentially smash the Lex Villarianalis, and let's look at how Pompey is going to further accumulate power at the Senate's expense. And the problems in the sort of early 60s BC was the infestation of pirates in the Mediterranean, notable because of the mismanagement of Sicily from the governor Verres. So obviously as part of your course you've got to look at Cicero's prosecution of Verres. That has meant that grain prices is high, the Roman navy has been supposedly neglected on Sicily, and problem number two is Mithridates still controls the east. So there are solutions, and this is where Pompey really starts to use those tribunes. The solution to number one is the Lex Gabinia, where Pompey is given a huge command of an army for 3 years. It's incredibly controversial because of the task force that Pompey is given, and also the fact that Pompey, again, is just a normal senator. He's not a consul, he's not a praetor at this point. Cicero is silent about this. Pompey is given 3 years to deal with the pirates, and he does it in 3 months. And because he deals with the pirates in 3 months, there's a clamour in Rome for Pompey to go and deal with threat number 2, Mithridates. And this is where the tribune Manilius is able to push for the Lex Manilia, where Pompey's given a huge command for 5 years this time in order to deal with Mithridates. It's controversial for the exact same reasons as the Lex Gabinia, but you could argue it's even more controversial because there was already a guy over there fighting Mithridates, a chap called Lucullus. Now, the Lex Manilia prompts a debate in the Senate between supporters of the bill and people who are against it. Not surprisingly, the optimates are against the Lex Manilia, and Catullus, who's one of the lead optimates, he argues against it pretty strongly, and it's Cassius Dio that gives us this. Now, Dio is obviously a bit of a later writer, but as a senator, he'll have been aware of the typical sort of debates in the Senate, and will have had access to historians that had written at the time. And what does Catullus argue? Well, he argues that, first of all, if you give one person too much power, then that person will basically struggle to then give up that power. It does not lie in human nature for a person, after holding so many positions of authority for a long period, to become willing to abide by the law. His second point is even more pertinent. He says that's why we've got consuls and praetors. So these are the people that are supposed to hold imperium, not a private person like Pompey. Cicero, for reasons that might link to his election for consulship later on, has certainly thrown his lot in with Pompey, and he actually makes the argument that the Roman Republic has always made new precedents in the past. Pompey is a gifted general, and he's ready for the Senate to use. And the crucial thing is for Cicero is that Pompey's career has already been extraordinary, and it's been extraordinary because of the Senate's full approval. And he finishes off his statement with this: all those innovations given to Pompey were from enactments by our national leaders, of whom Catullus was one. So you can argue that the Lex Manilia is a really important step in the undermining of the Senate's authority. Let's move on to Cicero's consulship in 63 BC, and I think you can argue that this is one of the high points of senatorial authority in the late Republic. Cicero has used various methods to become elected as consul in 63 BC alongside Antonius. Obviously, this year is particularly notable for the Catilinarian conspiracy. There's Catiline looking all grumpy over here, and Cicero supposedly giving one of his Catilinarian orations over here, looking way older than he would have done, but anyway. So if we delve into Cicero's consulship, well, we can actually see one of the first incidents of the year, which is Cicero's moves against the proposed Rullan bill, you could say does actually show senatorial strength. So the Rullan bill had proposed the redistribution of conquered land amongst the people, and this could be interpreted as an attack on Pompey, who Cicero is aligned with. The crucial thing here is that Cicero, as consul, makes the speech de Lega Agraria, and of course Cicero did edit and publish his speeches after, but it's a contemporary source, so it's really, really quite useful. And Cicero manages to persuade the people to move against, and the Senate to move against the Rullan bill. And the way that he does that is by saying that the people behind Rullus and his Rullan bill are people that aren't really true populares, people that are actually just trying to attack the Senate to gain their own private power, possibly hinting that this is Crassus and Caesar. And you can see the bold quote at the bottom: if there are men who hold out to the Roman people the hope of land grants, but whose secret purpose is quite different from their public claims, they do not deserve the name populares. And the Rullan bill is dropped. Secondly, I think you can use Cicero's consulship of 63 BC to make the claim that this is a high point of senatorial authority because of the way that the Catiline threat was dealt with. Now, this is where we can use Sallust. Sallust is really a great source to complement Cicero's own highly edited speeches. Sallust, of course, is a near contemporary. Yes, he's a supporter of Caesar, which you could say sort of makes him less valuable. He's also a moralist, but crucially, again, Sallust is a near contemporary, and he's fantastic for giving us a little window into what goes on in terms of the Catilinarian conspiracy, but for this question, how the Senate dealt with the threat of Catiline. And Sallust tells us about what Rome's like and why someone like Catiline would profit in the late Republic, and he talks about the corruption and vice of Rome at this point. But the crucial thing is that he's also telling us how Cicero dealt with this particular conspiracy and how the Senate worked together to deal with the plot as well. And I think the high point of Sallust's coverage of the Catilinarian conspiracy that shows senatorial strength is the debate between Caesar and Cato as to what would happen with the plotters. Caesar had already argued in the Senate that the plotters should be imprisoned for life, which is when Cato, sensing that the senatorial view was going into Caesar's favour, Cato delivered a speech where he was actually saying that really the plotters needed to be dealt with as if they'd been successful in their crimes. So if you look at the second paragraph, citizens of the greatest nobility have conspired to burn their fatherland. They summon the Gauls, a people most hostile to the name of Rome, to war. The enemy leader and his army are poised over our heads. Do you then still hesitate and doubt what to do with the enemies caught inside the walls? Catiline, with his armies pressing us at the throat, other enemies are inside the walls, and no preparation or discussion is possible in secret. And Cato swings the vote in his way. The plotters are executed without trial. That's going to really sort of hit Cicero later on. Cicero is given the honorific title Pater Patriae by the Senate, and Antonius is sent, the other consul is sent to dispatch Catiline. So I think that the way that this plot is snuffed out and dealt with by the Senate, you could argue is a high point and shows that the Senate do have strength in this period. Let's move on to the First Triumvirate, because again this starts with the sign of senatorial strength. So the First Triumvirate is between Pompey, Caesar and Crassus. And really, what happens here is when Pompey's come back from defeating Mithridates, he needs two things: land for his veterans, and he needed his settlement of the East ratified. Crassus, at the same time, needed compensation for his equites. He'd promised them this. And basically, Pompey and Crassus were being blocked by Cato, the Optimatus. Now, you could say that that is a sign of senatorial strength and resistance to the triumvirate, absolutely, but this actually forces the triumvirate to be created. So kind of using Pompey's overwhelming popular support and Crassus's wealth, Caesar becomes consul in 59 BC. And as consul in 59 BC, he's able to pass laws for the benefit of Pompey, Crassus, and himself. The Republic and the Senate has been hijacked. Plutarch says this about the triumvirate in verse 48 of his Life of Pompey, and he tells us how Pompey filled the city with soldiers and carried everything with a high hand. Bibulus, the co-consul, was going down to the forum with Lucullus and Cato. The crowd fell upon him and broke the fasces of his lictors, and somebody threw a basket of dung all over his head. Again, this tells you the level of control that the triumvirate have got. So therefore, if we link it back to our question, we've got senatorial weakness. We've, of course, got a phenomenal source for all of this drama, and that is, of course, Cicero. And Cicero, writing to his good friend Atticus in 59, again, contemporary, actually in the middle of Rome during these events, is able to give the real eye-opener as to what's going on. And he is really melancholy in regard to the situation of the Republic. The Republic is finished. He says how the triumvirate are universally attested. But for me, the best sentence of this, the best phrase of this, was when he blames Cato for the triumvirate's creation. We know by experience the violent temper and recklessness of these men who, in their rage against Cato, have brought Rome to ruin. Now, of course, the triumvirate does break down. We're skipping ahead a little bit over here. It breaks down for a range of reasons. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter, and Pompey's wife. Likewise, the growing rivalry of Pompey and Caesar, and the fact that Caesar's been so successful in Gaul. But crucially, we've also got the third person. Crassus is taken out by the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae. So we've now got maybe a balancing member taken out of the equation. And Pompey and Caesar are on a collision for a civil war. Pompey increasingly moves towards the optimates. Caesar obviously still populares. And the crucial thing is that where does the Senate figure in this? Because is the Senate strong or are the Senate weak? And again, I think we can argue that the Senate are increasingly weak in this period. So let's have a look at what our sources are saying. Well, certainly in terms of the build-up of the Civil War, Plutarch in his Life of Caesar talks about how Caesar's demands were fair, and when presented to the people, he's loudly applauded. But Plutarch actually says that the majority in the Senate seem to actually want to move against Caesar. Very few don't want Pompey to give up his army, and more want Caesar to give up his army. Suetonius is a little bit more balanced. Plutarch seems to be quite pro-Caesar. Suetonius is a little bit more balanced and essentially says that Pompey had actually allowed Caesar to stand in absentia. Caesar's bribery is a particular problem. And likewise, the Senate's ignoring of Antony's veto was Caesar's excuse for a civil war. So Plutarch and Suetonius are, again, almost sort of portraying the Senate as puppets. And I think we get a better version of this, how the Senate are, again, being quite intimidated by, or written from, Caesar himself. So Caesar writes De Bello Civili, which is on the Civil War. Now, obviously, this is propaganda. It's clearly written to show that Caesar was almost the victim. It's written in a positive light, but it's crucially important because it shows us how Caesar wanted his actions to be interpreted by people at the time and people later on. And Caesar goes to great lengths to show that really the Senate only side with Pompey because they're intimidated. So you can see this in this section here. Most of the Senate, intimidated by the declarations of the consul, by the fears of a present army and the threats of Pompey's friends, unwillingly and reluctantly adopted Scipio's opinion that Caesar should disband his army by a certain day, and should he not do so, he should be considered as acting against the state. So Caesar is saying that the Senate are intimidated and the Senate are weak. And this inevitably leads to a civil war. We're going to fast forward a little bit to after Pompey has ended up with his head in a basket and Caesar has returned to Rome and has been declared as dictator perpetuus and starts passing laws which, again, because of the manner and the nature of Caesar's dictatorship as outlined by Plutarch and Suetonius, you can make the argument that the Senate is incredibly weak and impotent during this particular period. So if we look at Suetonius, we can see the laws that Caesar passes as dictator, rewarding his veterans, rewarding the people, public shows, very populares type things to do. The increasing number of magistrates, laws against luxury and extravagance, so a bit of a mixed bag. And equally, if we look at Plutarch and his coverage on Caesar in 57 and 58, we've got the discussion of the Lupercal festival and Antony's attempted crowning of Caesar, and Plutarch's discussion of whether Caesar intended to be king and his attempt to go on expedition against the Parthians. This leads inevitably to Caesar's assassination. So that's, again, a debate. On the one hand, we could say that Caesar's dictatorship shows the Senate to be weak, but on the other hand, there's enough senators that really oppose what Caesar is doing in order to take action. And that is obviously Caesar's assassination. Let's wrap this up in regard to the Second Triumvirate, and we're going to start off with Caesar's assassination, and in particular, one of our coin sources. So we've got the coin of Brutus here, which is celebrating the assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March, and the restoration, you can see by the freed slave hat here, the Peleus, the restoration of peace and freedom, rather, to the Republic. So what's happened? Well, after Caesar's assassination, we're told by Suetonius, by Plutarch, that there is some type of temporary amnesty negotiated by Cicero, by Antony, by the leading plotters, and there is a funeral for Caesar that's celebrated by Antony and by Brutus. Brutus, by all accounts, gives a very, very poor speech. Antony gives an impassioned speech about Caesar, which whips up the people, and the plotters soon have to flee Rome. The liberators, as Cicero calls them, flee Rome after Caesar's death. So at this point that Cicero is going to go and visit Brutus and Cassius. Decimus Brutus, one of the plotters, supposed to raise troops against Antony, but doesn't. Antony offers Brutus and Cassius the grain supervisor roles, which is a bit of a veiled insult, and Cicero goes to meet Brutus and Cassius at Antium. Now, this is really, really important because, again, we've got an eyewitness account about this meeting with Brutus and Cassius, and it's an absolutely fantastic letter, which sums up how Brutus and Cassius are feeling now that the assassination has gone so wrong, and now that Antony is firmly in control, and also paints a little picture of Cicero's despair at the lack of planning of Brutus and Cassius, but also maybe despair about the Senate's weakness in stopping a Caesar number 2. Now, if we have a look at the letter that Cicero writes to Atticus about the meeting with Brutus and Cassius on the 8th of June 44, there's some phenomenal stuff here. And what Cicero is doing is he's basically criticising the plotters for 3 key failings. He says that, first of all, Caesar shouldn't have been the only person that was killed, i.e. Antony should have been killed with Caesar. He says the Senate should have been roused and that more should have been done to rouse the excited populace. The Senate should have been brought together instead of Antony doing that, and Brutus's funeral speech should have basically been better. And he almost finishes this letter with this particular phrase: I found the ship falling in pieces, or rather already in fragments, not a sign of plan, logic, or system. So Cicero is not pinning his hopes of the Republic on Brutus and Cassius. Cicero is going to decide to go back to Rome and to take on Antony himself with his Philippics. And they're going to be reasonably successful. Antony, towards the end, is going to want to get the command for Gaul. The Senate are going to refuse this, and Antony, again, to cut a long story short, is basically going to pinch and try and take by force Decimus Brutus's province of Cisalpine Gaul. And the Senate and Cicero, to show a little bit of strength, have to wait until the new year, where Antony is then declared an enemy of the state in 43 BC, and the two new consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, raise 4 fresh legions. This is where the Senate play their ace, or what they think is their ace. And their ace is the young Octavian, who has just essentially gone unnoticed under the radar and has recruited 4 legions of Caesar's veterans. And using the precedent that, of course, Sulla used with Pompey in legalizing his force by a gift of pro-Praetorian imperium, the Senate do the exact same thing with Octavian. And Hirtius, Pansa, and Octavian are sent to go and deal with Antony, and we have the resulting Battle of Mutina. Was Cicero right to use Octavian? Well, maybe Cicero didn't have much choice, because the two consuls certainly, and the armies that they've got, they're fresh recruits. Octavian has Caesar's veterans. There's a really interesting insight into Cicero's mind in his letter to Atticus on the 4th of November, where he says that he doesn't trust Octavian, that there's too many around him that threaten death to our friends. So what happens at Mutina? Obviously, Antony has gone to try and attack Decimus Brutus at Mutina. Hirtius and Pansa and Octavia are sent to deal with them, and we have the resulting Battle of Mutina. At the Battle of Mutina, Antony is roundly defeated and legs it into the Alps. But the important thing, Hirtius and Pansa, the two consuls, are both killed. Now, according to which source we use, these are either accidental deaths or clearly planned deaths. If you know your Tacitus, he's absolutely 100% down with the idea that Octavian is behind the murders of Hirtius and Pansa. So they're both dead, and Octavian assumes control over their armies. At this point, Octavian is kind of shunned by the Senate. Cicero uses his very famous quip, raised, praised, erased, about Octavian. And the Senate start to anger Octavian, which is incredibly short term, by not giving him a triumph and by giving the command to finish off Antony to Decimus Brutus and Lepidus. Octavian, in retaliation, marches on the city with his troops. To the north, Decimus Brutus is going to be murdered by his own troops, and Lepidus defects to Antony. And what we're going to see is that Octavian and his march on Rome, after being declared consul, is then going to very quickly move north to Antony and Lepidus, put aside their differences, and create something called the Second Triumvirate. So we've skipped over a fair old bit there, but what crucial material have we got in our sources that show the Senate to be so weak to allow a Second Triumvirate to form? Well, with Appian, who is a fantastic later writer, who is, because he's free, and he's writing later, he's free from the need to produce any propaganda about Augustus, Octavian, the future Augustus. And this means that he can be quite critical about Octavian's actions, but he's also really quite critical about the Senate. And this particular extract from Appian is where he illustrates how the Senate are a little bit all talk. So first of all, they've actually said that they'll do a deal with Octavian, a compromise, but then they realize that they should not be such terrified cowards, nor accept another despotic regime without a fight. And on the contrary, they should arm themselves from available resources and confront their attackers with their constitution. They would fight to the death rather than to submit to slavery. Now skip a little bit where Octavian's troops finally arrive into the city and the Senate do a full complete switch. A full 180. And essentially now the Senate seem to start to merge into the Senate that we look at with the Julio-Claudian emperors, really quite impotent and quite weak. They're intimidated by the presence of this young warlord and his soldiers in the city. Octavian's opponents went out to greet him in separate groups all along the way, greeting him with every sign of friendliness and a spineless readiness to serve. This is further corroborated by Suetonius. So Suetonius, when he's writing about Augustus in verse 26, talks about how the centurions and the legionaries march on Rome and effectively demand Octavian that he becomes consul. When the Senate objected, a centurion threw back his cloak, displayed the hilt of his sword, and boldly said, "If you do not make him consul, this will." And I think this final part is a bit to sort of finish off the idea that the Senate is indeed weak during this period, or has been completely stripped of its courage and its ancient pride almost. This coin produced by Antony, where he's honouring Caesar as dictator. Obviously, before his assassination, Antony's here with his mourning beard. But essentially, it's the Second Triumvirate, Octavian's actions, that really completely dismantle the Senate's strength. And really, over the next decade, over the 30s BC, where the ultimate power play is between Octavian and Antony, we can see the Senate further eroded of its power, of its prestige, and of its authority.